What the automobile did for America in the first half of the century, the university will do today. Clark Kerr, President, University of California.
Dear Bob, so my kid brother's high school class is beginning to think about college. Sure, I'll be glad to help you prepare a report on Michigan State. Your first friend on the faculty will probably be your enrollment officer, the person who helps you get organized at registration time. Another friend will be your counselor, who talks over your interest and background and helps you map your college program. He's available for consultation anytime during your college career when you need advice about personal problems of any kind.
I was raped in my sophomore year, and they threw me out of school. And this is 26 years ago now. And it's still a reference point in my life, and it's still very painful. And I believe this was the beginning of my personal radicalization. We all had a habit of hitchhiking. Unfortunate habit. And I was the one who it caught up with this bad habit, and I was raped. And my first reaction, being the idealistic young woman that I was to go straight to the police. And what I did not understand was that going to the police made the event public and put the university on the spot. And they forced me to leave. But my future was being taken away from me from nothing that I had done that had any malice or harm in it. Harm was done to me.
Embarrassed administrators like these were free to throw Judith Karpova out because they had absolute power. They didn't want their boat rocked. Like the rest of society, their goal was to maintain the status quo. That meant white male dominance, frequently racial and religious quotas, and trouble for people like Judith Karpova. In these old films, students look relaxed and free to do as they like. What you can't see is that they were subject to a system known as in loco parentis, in place of parents, in which administrators treated them like children. That's what parents expected.
I have never had any doubt but what Larry could do better work than what he's doing, as I said. I believe that when you get to college, you'll find out that it isn't the playtime that you have in high school. And it's up to him to find that out. And I don't believe it'll take them very long to show him that they separate the boys from the men when you get into the universities.
For most young people in 1960, college was a continuation of high school and the next step on the path to career and marriage. Any criticism of the system would have to come from someone else, like little-known songwriter Malvina Reynolds.
Of course, as every girl, I have aspirations to someday be married and raise a family, and to someday be in love with someone very, very much, so that even after I'm past 30, even after I'm past 30, there's something to live for, because you have someone to give your life to, someone to do things for, to take away from the monotony of life, because as long as you're giving of yourself, you still have something to live for.
Maybe a nice home in suburbia, and some nice kids, and a beer and a ball game on a Saturday afternoon.
At Oregon State College, something new has been added. It's a student covered from head to ankle in a black bag. At first, classmates were hostile toward what appeared to be a far-out prank. The unidentified student attends only one class dressed this way. He says his idea is a testing of student conformity.
Student conformity. That described the behavior of an overwhelming majority of middle-class white college students. But there was another group that didn't conform, a group that had already begun rebelling against what society had in mind for them. They were young black students attending black colleges in the South. As the decade began, these activist black students and the mainly placid white students were scarcely aware of each other. But within 4 years, They would together bring about fundamental changes in American society. It began with a new mood in the country, a renewed desire for change. One key reason, the 1960 election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Absolutely clear, no question about it, that Kennedy created the general atmosphere, created a climate of high idealism. And I think, you know, in telling the story of the 60s, that would be the most important thing too. At the beginning, the idealism was evangelical. I mean, there was absolutely a sense of we will make a beautiful world, a much better world, a more humane world, a more cheerful world, a world that will be much more equalitarian than the world will be, a much more compassionate world. There was, I mean, it was marvelous.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Ask not what your country can do for you.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not what your country can do.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Ask what you can do for your country.
This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Country, 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 country,
There was a sense that anything was possible. Anything could happen. We were in the heels of a revolution. Everybody was talking about a better society. Here was a generation, my generation, my friends and I, who really believed we were going to live in a time in which the conditions that we saw as troubling would disappear. We could make them disappear. Maybe you couldn't do it alone, but the whole generation together could make it happen. And that was awfully, awfully exciting. So that this stream of idealism was very, very powerful.
Good evening and welcome. I'd like to start out with a real protest song called I Ain't Marching Anymore. Oh, I marched to the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the early British wars. The young land started growing, the young blood started flowing.
Just as John Kennedy had touched young people with his idealistic words, Phil Oakes, Bob Dylan, and many other folk singers touched young people with their songs. And thousands of them came to coffee houses to listen to this music, which seemed to reflect their personal concerns so well.
We were in a nightmare of frozen emotional and social distances. We cut through those. We, as folk music people, may have been a little pretty absurd, you know, making believe we were chain gang convicts. But we did have deep feelings and were not afraid to talk about them and to sing about them. And remember, this was in a period where entertainment was, you know, Las Vegas, and the whole thing of the entertainer who is very good and wants to let you know how bright he is and how well he's doing is. We couldn't care less how good we were. We were our music.
Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I stole California from the Mexican land, fought in the bloody Civil War. Yes, I even killed my brothers and so many others, but I ain't marching anymore.
In places like these, students mingled with all kinds of social outsiders, Negroes, beatniks, eccentrics, radicals. and they heard all kinds of unconventional ideas about family, school, country, and civil rights.
If you don't see me in the back of the bus, you can't find me nowhere. Oh, come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting right there. I'll be sitting right there. I'll be sitting right there. Oh, come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting right there.
If you miss me in the Mississippi River, you can get off again.
Another critical event in the evolution of the 60s phenomena were the black student sit-ins starting in February of 1960. Black college students throughout the Upper South initially organized themselves to go to sit in at lunch counters all through the Upper South in the towns in which those colleges were located. The demonstrations were nonviolent, and tremendously effective in desegregating facilities. More importantly, they were tremendously effective in suggesting what the possibilities for student activism were. And the college students, black college students as in those all-black institutions, provided the spark that revitalized the movement and ultimately provided many of the models ideologically, tactically, etc., for white student activism later in the decade.
It was a fabulous time. It was a great time to be in college and to be black and, you know, get that sense that, hey, things are changing. We're going to change the world. And, you know, we're going to South. There were the freedom rides. There was so much happening and so many exciting things that built hope. And you said, hey, you know, America's finally going to become America.
It was almost indescribable in terms of changing my outlook on life and somehow bringing to an awareness that I can make a difference. Because as I grew up, all I knew was you do what you have to do to survive. But then, as a college student, I learned to take some risks. I remember as, it was my sophomore year, we had the first demonstration in Talladega, Alabama, and I just pulled all of my courage together and joined that march. And about 100 of us went downtown Talladega and marched around the courthouse, scared to death. Just knew we were gonna get clubbed and hauled off to jail, and then I was gonna have to explain to my mom and dad what I was doing down there. But I was out there on the cutting edge, and it really made me feel good. And if I hadn't been at a black college, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that.
Black students who were veterans of these actions quickly organized into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC and other black groups attacked segregation and the deep-rooted traditions behind it with nonviolent demonstrations and protests at public facilities.
The Negro is not a part of my family.
As a result, I don't elect to have him sit and eat with me. As a result, I don't elect to have him belong to a club that I may belong to. This is the way it has been. It's the history of the South. It's because we've been brought up like this. We have been taught like this. And we teach our children like this. And they'll teach their children like that. I think it is a matter that has been history all down through the years and will remain history.
The SNCC students wanted to change the history of racial segregation, and they thought the time had come because of their sit-in successes. They believed that willpower alone could wipe out the entire system of American apartheid. That's how optimistic, or how naive, or how determined they were. They and the other civil rights groups divided up the South so each could concentrate on one area.
We claim Mississippi as our own. Young, foolish, dumb, really. We said, we're gonna go in here, we're gonna break this place open. And our theory was that if we brought down Mississippi, the rest of the South would have to fall. And because this was the worst of the places. And how would we bring it down? We would flood the state with black and white students and so overpower it with our nonviolence and our freedom schools that it would not be able to resist. And then the rest of the South would look at it and say, oh, look what those students did in Mississippi, over here in Tennessee and Virginia, we better watch out. And we thought it would all come tumbling down. It didn't quite happen that way. But I tell you, it wasn't a bad theory.
You put that date right there. If you were born here in Dallas and Boca Chili, you would put date of your birth.
What did Eleanor Holmes Norton and her SNCC colleagues intend to do in Mississippi? To register as many black voters as they could, because they believed that with enough black voters, they could defeat the laws and the leaders that kept segregation alive. Their effort began with organizing.
We'll be more than gladly to arrange transportation for you to get down there today if you can't go on your own.
Our position was we had to get people to crack through the fear, and that had to be done on a one-to-one basis, and it had to be we had to make sure that we were talking to people about their own self-interest, because we never lied to someone and said, look, there's no harm in this. Your name's not going to be published in the newspaper, and if the sheriff comes at you, we will protect you. We couldn't do that.
They could stick a dynamite right through this window here in this church. I sure hope, people around the world will respond to it, so we don't die for nothing. Okay, let's move. Let's have some volunteers up here so Larry can set up this workshop. We shall go to earth.
Thousands of young black people were learning the theory and practice of nonviolence. They had to be taught because nonviolence isn't the way people normally react to intimidation. They had to learn to hold their tempers, whatever the provocation.
This young man really isn't protected at all. His hands ought to be over his head. He should be protected. He's doing a good thing. Notice, he went down here to protect his brother down here, his sister. This young lady under here is being protected by him. But also, he didn't really protect her as well as he could be, as well as he could have. For one, this young lady here is exposed. Her head is all left open. These signs, you can drop these signs and police will start to beat you and immediately cover your head. You have to curl up. Now this young lady, her most important part is her head and her internal section. Her internal section is protected, but her head isn't, because it's right here. His elbow is over it. So get up a second, I'll show you. Now you stay here and lie across this way. No, across her neck. No, the way I'm standing. That's right. This is the way he should lie in order to protect her. Now, she is well protected. In order to protect himself, cross your legs. So they can't jab a stick in between your legs and hurt you. Now his head's protected, he's all right. Now you've got to be careful not to suffocate the person underneath. But when times are difficult, these are the methods that you have to use. Now she has to curl up a little more and put your head right against his body. Now this group is still fairly well protected, even though she feels a little weight. She's not feeling anyone hitting her with a stick. So this can be these are very effective techniques in this whole idea school of nonviolence.
Here I had been raised with guns all my life. I'd been shooting since I was 10 years old, you know. And quite frankly, by now I've even shot at a few folk, you know. But the workshops, they would do workshops every night with people who wanted to help work with the project. And I can remember them being very heavy into it, the nonviolent question. I mean, the whole history of Gandhi. It was started with Gandhi. And the whole history, and then you had so many preachers running around. Everybody was a reverend in them days, or wanted to be a preacher. So they were connected with Jesus, you know, so you had Jesus, you had Gandhi, you had Martin Luther King, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And still, I'm looking at all these accomplishments and saying they did this with nonviolence? This is unbelievable. So you know, it was like total acceptance. Let's do it if it works like that.
Despite their nonviolence, the civil rights workers were being attacked, and they were not getting the protection they had asked for from the Kennedy administration. John Kennedy was concerned enough to speak out against the violence, but he did nothing concrete to prevent it because he was afraid to anger Southern Democrats.
He was trying to play both ends against the middle. He had been elected by a very narrow margin, and he wanted to be reelected in '64, and he knew he couldn't be reelected in '64 if he came to be overly identified with either party to the struggle. Now, I do think genuinely he came to be moved and to learn a heck of a lot about the civil rights struggle and to be ultimately quite committed to it by the end of his life. But he was in no way the catalyst for what occurred in the '60s.
John Kennedy didn't think the civil rights struggle was his most pressing problem. His greatest worry was communism, the Soviet Union, and the possibility of nuclear war.
The real problem is the Soviet desire to expand their power and influence. If Mr. Khrushchev would concern himself with the real interests of the people of the Soviet Union, that they have a higher standard of living, to protect his own security, there's no real reason why the United States and the Soviet Union, separated by so many thousands of miles of land and water, both rich countries, both with very energetic people, should not be able to live in peace. So the combination of these two systems in conflict around the world in a nuclear age is what makes the '60s so dangerous.
It was just a little while ago I glued my ears to the radio. The announcer was saying we better beware, a crisis was hanging way up in the air. Crawling on the ground, swimming in the sea, heading for me. Well, I didn't know if I was for or against it. He was yelling and screaming a mile a minute. Well, he said, here comes the president, but first this word from Pepsodent. Have whiter teeth, have cleaner breath when you're facing nuclear death. And then President John began to speak, and I knew right away he wouldn't be weak. Well, he said he'd seen some missile bases and terrible smiles on Cuban faces, close pictures, carrying land reform too far, giving land to the USSR. Well, he said we mustn't be afraid, we're setting up a little blockade. Put our ships along the Cuban shores, and if the Russian bear yells and roars, we'll let him have it.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest America has ever come to atomic destruction, shook up many Americans, especially young Americans, just as they had been shaken by the violent reaction to civil rights protesters.
We thought, why do we have to be afraid of dying? Are we really going to die? Is there really going to be a nuclear war? And why do we have to think about this? This is too big for us. I remember the absolutely stunned hush. I remember the sense of wanting to stay indoors, of being actually afraid to walk outside, not because something was going to fall from the sky at this particular moment, but because the sense of crisis was so intense and our unpreparedness for it. And our sense of being afflicted with it was so intense that you did not want to walk alone out under that sky.
And television was bringing home other distressing realities.
I think we in the Midwest had been sheltered from what was happening in the South, what was happening in the black community in the South. And when television came on the horizon, we weren't sheltered anymore. And we saw what human beings were doing to each other. And it was really very shocking, very hurtful.
We were brought up very idealistic. I was taught that there were things that were right and wrong and that America stood for certain things. And I got to a certain age and I looked around and I said, except it's not true. That there, and my first instinct was, well, this is clearly, something's fallen through the cracks here and we just have to point it out and say, there are these people who are hungry or people who can't vote or people getting beaten up. And, if we just make people aware of that it'll get solved right away. And of course it didn't get solved right away. And therefore we began to challenge more and more the lies. And I really think that that's the basis of my anger and outrage in the 60s, was that I had been lied to about what America was all about. I liked what I had been told America was about, and I was simply trying to make the reality conform with the promise. And the more it became difficult to make the reality to conform to the promise, the angrier I got, and my friends got.
Thoroughly alarmed by the violent white reaction to the protesters, President Kennedy had to act. He sent a civil rights bill to Congress that, if passed, would outlaw discrimination in restaurants, hotels, swimming pools, and other public places. Every major civil rights organization, plus union and student groups from all over the country, banded together to stage a massive demonstration in Washington in support of the bill. They hoped an impressive and peaceful rally would force Congress to pass it. Hundreds of thousands of people responded to the call. What took place that day was one of the most memorable events of the 60s and a high point in the civil rights struggle.